Thanks for being here today. We are excited to share our research with you. So let me go ahead and put this up on the screen and we'll get started. All right, so hopefully you all are in the right place to see women leaders' motivations, obstacles, and success strategies in their careers. That will be the topic of our presentation today. And I'm so pleased to be the presenter on behalf of our research community with you. I'm an associate professor and lead faculty for business leadership degrees at UAGC. And I also, sorry, tech's a little slow today. I also am coming out of a career in leadership development with internal roles within Fortune 500 companies and also consultancies to them. So leadership development is something that I've really focused on over the last 20 years. I am currently research lead and a board member for our Center for Women's Leadership. I know that many of you are joining us from that community today, so welcome. And our particular focus in the research group is on leadership development as it relates to women in their careers. I'd like to begin this presentation with a very big thank you to our research committee, Dr. Maya Zelahik and Brandy Havens, who have really been instrumental in this research. And also to our CWL board. We have a large board with many very accomplished people in the area of leadership development as well. And thank you to the participants of our study that we launched in June, which is a large portion of this presentation today. So I'm sure that many of you that are joining us actually had the opportunity to participate in the research, and we're so thankful to you for sharing your experiences with us. So let's begin by looking at some research findings. Now, it will be helpful for all of you to know, as a way of setting the stage here, that the seed of this research really began with a question. And that question was, what is the current state of women's leadership in their careers? What are some of the dark sides, if you will, the career challenges, the statistics that you might hear about that aren't favorable? But what are also some bright sides? Where has progress been made? And so you'll see that in these research findings, we're going to be looking at both. So let's begin with a look at the career challenges that women leaders face across cultures and professions. Much of this research has been drawn from specifically the last 5 to 6 years. So it's all very current, and it's drawn from a number of different organizations who do research in this area. We'll then get into the empirical research findings. So this is the study that we performed last year, specifically on motivations, obstacles, and success strategies. We'll then press pause for a moment to reflect on what does all of this mean in terms of the impact on continued inequality. We'll look at organizational strategies to reduce these inequalities. So for those of you that are on this session, you're coming from a leadership role within your organizations, whether you are in an executive role, a manager role, an influencer, or in HR. These are the kinds of tips that could be very helpful to reduce inequality in your organizations. And then lastly, we'll talk about individual strategies to aid career success. So if you've joined this session because you personally want to understand how this, what we know from research in terms of informing what can we do to aid our careers, we'll chat about that as well. We'll have some audience Q&A at the end. So for any of you that have questions as we go along, feel free to pop those into the chat. We'll pull those back up at the end and get to as many questions as we can. Let's begin with the dark side. So what are some of the statistics, research findings that are showing continued inequality for women in their careers? So you'll see here that this is from Fortune 2020 research. there are very few women in senior leadership roles in the Fortune 500 itself. You'll see two statistics up here. The CEO, only about 6.4% of CEOs of the Fortune 500 were in these kinds of roles, and were women at the time of this study. Now, that statistic doesn't change very much over time. So we've seen this jump up to 7%. We've seen it at 3%. It doesn't fluctuate too much beyond the low single digits. In terms of senior managers, you see that less than 25% of senior managers are women among these Fortune 500 companies as well. This statistic has gotten a lot of press, so you might have seen this one before, but Ernst & Young and the glass ceiling report that they produce came out about 5 years ago and said, in our analysis, we've actually found that the percent of women in these big companies is actually smaller than men who are named John or David. So a really striking picture of how few women there are in these roles compared to men. This particular statistic is one that we've been digging into quite a bit in terms of our own research and the direction that we'd like to take our research for the future in the Center for Women's Leadership. And it is that men are 30% more likely to be promoted from entry level to manager. Now, this statistic has been around for quite some time. You'll see this particular one came from McKinsey and Company, their Women in the Workplace report in 2019. 30% more likely to be promoted. And so this raises all kinds of questions about why. And it's something that we feel very strongly about digging into, because what the research is showing across different studies is that it's not for a lack of desire. It's not necessarily that women don't want to be in those roles. It's that they're missing what's called a rung on the ladder. Their support mechanisms to get from entry level to manager are missing or not sustainable in many cases. So the reasons will look different, perhaps, from organization to organization, but the statistic itself still remains that this is really a gap that we see out in women's leadership research. Overall, we know that women are paid less than men. Now, it also is a long-standing statistic. It also has had very little movement over time. You'll see that this particular number up on the screen is higher than what you might have seen recently. I've seen the number as low as 70 cents on the dollar. This one's saying 82 cents on the dollar. And this is coming from the Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap, which this study was done in fall of 2018. So women are making at least 18, perhaps 20% less than men on average. And you'll see that over the course of a year, they lose $10,000 each on average due to this gender pay gap. So it is substantial. And we'll talk at the end of the presentation about some of the things that organizations can do to really evaluate this and make positive change. We know that women are paid less even when they're in the same jobs as men. And so when the statistic about pay has come up, one of the criticisms has been, well, are we comparing apples to apples? And the answer to this is yes. When studies have been done looking at the same jobs at the same level between women and men, there is still a pay gap that exists. And so you'll see some of the measures here across nurses, cashiers, teachers, chefs and cooks, and managers. Some of these gaps are quite a bit bigger than others, but the gap still exists. You'll also see from leanin.org, this is an organization that Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook notoriety established. It's a really great organization with a lot of resources to help women in their careers. They found that women are just as likely to pursue high-paying careers as men, but they're still paid less. And One of the most troubling statistics, I think, is that women of color are paid even less. So on the spectrum of pay, you'll see here that this particular study shows that, um, as we look across ethnicity, those numbers start getting even more dire. So another question that comes up in terms of women's pay and why they're paid less, well, do they have the same qualifications as men? And research studies are showing that yes, in fact, women for many years have been graduating at higher rates from college than men. So they tend to have more higher education in comparison to the male population. But that pay gap actually increases for women at higher education levels. So you can see on the screen that when we look across different levels of education, that pay gap exists, but it gets much bigger when we're comparing populations with advanced degrees. So a woman with an advanced degree makes significantly less in many cases than her male counterpart with that degree. There are some other reasons why women are not advancing at the same rates. And so some of the research is looking at the behavior of women themselves, or I should say ourselves, since I fall into that category. What are perhaps some barriers or behaviors that are creating some disparity? And so I find this particular statistic quite interesting. It came out of Harvard Business Review in 2014. Women and men apply to jobs differently. So, in a study looking at this particular behavior, they found that men apply for a job when they meet just 60% of the qualifications. So, if most of the job looks like something they're interested in and can do, they tend to apply. But women are more conservative in this respect, and some have hypothesized that it has to do with perhaps self confidence. Perhaps it is pragmatism. Well, if the job description is calling for, these 10 things, I need to have all 10 to be successful. So this is something that I would invite everyone to consider who's here in terms of your own behavior in applying for jobs. Is this perhaps an area that you need to explore more fully for yourself or within your organization? What about pay raises? Studies are showing that women do actually ask for more, but they don't get it. So you'll see on the screen the percent of men and women that negotiated for a promotion is very similar in this study, 29% versus 27%. Negotiating for a raise, also very similar, 24 and 23%. So they're negotiating and asking at similar rates, but still not receiving the raises. One of the implications of the lower pay, specifically for women, is less opportunity for families. Now, certainly pay has implications across all populations in terms of their families. But the reason that this is so compelling for women is the statistics on the number of women who are heads of households, the number of women who are single parents. These numbers are often greater than the number of men in similar positions. And so we see that on the right, it says lower pay limits families' access to necessities, especially among Black mothers. 4 in 5 are primary providers for their families. So when that head of household is making less, the family's bringing in less, and it reduces the opportunity for their family as a whole. We know this statistic has broad application around the world. For example, those of you who perhaps have studied microfinance, micro-lending, one of the big pushes for these micro-lending initiatives, especially the not-for-profit companies, like Kiva that you may have heard of. They might offer small loans to women who want to start businesses because they know that the trickle down to families is so great. We know that the pay gap for women exists worldwide. So you'll see a map on the screen showing various percentages. Now, these are from different studies around the world. We see that on average, women earn 23% less than men, have less access to participation in the workforce or availability of credit, hence these micro lending efforts. And at the current rate, it will take 257 years to close this economic gap. This is really compelling because what we're showing here in our research from the Center for Women's Leadership is so many different studies that are all pointing to the same phenomenon. And again, we're just focused on the dark side right now, the continued inequality. We'll talk about some of the bright side here in a moment. We also know that most nations have never had a female leader. So we see here another map of the world with some color coding on it. And if you look at the map legend, you'll see that there are only 5 countries in the world who have had a female head of state for 5 years or more. When you look at the next category, 10 to 14 countries in the world have had 10 female leaders. But if you look across the yellow, these are some pretty large countries that have never had a female leader to date. This is from the Pew Research Center in 2017. Let's turn to the bright side for a moment. So the number of women who are governing countries has increased over the years. And so as of 2020, there were 18 women governing countries. You'll see many of their photos up here on the screen. And several of these women were recognized for their efforts and leadership during the pandemic, where some of their countries had the most favorable numbers in terms of controlling the spread of the pandemic. This was associated with female leadership. And there are studies that are being done to determine more about why that is. So I won't speak to that today. I don't know that we have definitive answers, but there's certainly some interesting emerging research in that area. You'll see that women lead about 7% of the world population, and that is roughly the same percentage as women CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. There's also some bright side statistics around the efforts that are being made to reduce gender inequality and empower women throughout the world. So what I've done here is popped up on the screen. These are images taken directly from the United Nations Women Organization. Now, this has only been around for a little over a decade, but they've been focused on each of these areas that you see on the screen. Participation in the labor force, reducing unemployment, mitigating occupational segregation, and you'll see many others up here. So some of you might take this as both a dark side and a bright side in that there's so much work to be done. But the bright side that we're highlighting here is that there's attention being placed on each of these areas. And in the case of UN Women, because they tend to focus on really marginalized populations around the world, it's particularly heartening, I think, to see how much effort is being done in this area. So if you haven't checked out UN Women's efforts, I encourage you to do so. We know that gender and ethnic diversity in a company lead to greater profitability in the studies that have been done. So you'll see here just one of the statistics. This comes out of McKinsey and Company in their Delivering Through Diversity report in 2018. We see that there's a 15 to 21% difference in profitability when there is diversity in gender and ethnicity in the executive ranks. Another bright side is we know that there are more women in senior roles globally than ever before. In 2019, there was a study done by Catalyst, another great organization in this area who focuses on women and equality. They found that 29% of senior management roles were held by women, and that is the highest number ever on record. 87% of global businesses have at least one woman in a senior management role. And that proportion does, of course, differ by the role that the woman is in and also by the region of the world. And you see that represented on the right when we look at different regions and the percentage of senior roles held by women. We see that there are higher numbers in Eastern Europe, for example, compared to Asia Pacific. We know that the number of women on boards, particularly in the USA for this study right here, is higher. Now, it's a pretty small percentage, but we see that board chairs that are women have climbed about 1% over the last several years, and board seats held by women have increased by about 5 percentage points. And this is from Deloitte. We know that in some positions, the situation has improved for women as well. So in this case, we see chief marketing officers have had greater representation by women CMOs as of 2019. Now, on the small business side, a lot of these statistics have looked at large corporations, these large employers. But there's also quite a bit of research being done on the entrepreneurial side. Women as small business owners is on the rise. And we see that over a 10-year period from 2002 to 2012, the number of women-owned firms increased at a rate that was 2.5 times the national average. Really terrific progress there. And you'll see some of the statistics here that these businesses are quite profitable. They generate $1.7 trillion in sales, and they're also large employers. When we look at the number of small businesses out there as employers, that really adds up. In terms of minority women, they are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in the USA. Now, sometimes this is painted as both a bright side and a dark side statistic because some of the reasons why minority women have gone into business for themselves, according to the research we've done, is because the opportunities for them in some corporations have not been there. And so it's really been an impetus for them to start their own businesses. But on the bright side, this is the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. And you'll see the numbers from 2002 to 2019, they've increased to 5.4 million firms owned by women of color. And this is from the Small Business Association. So now we're going to jump into the empirical research study. This is the study that we did through the Center for Women's Leadership. Our research design, we started the Center for Women's Leadership. We launched it officially June 26th of last year. So we're within our first year of operations, and I'm really proud to be a member of this organization and to have participated in so much good work, many other events and presentations that we've done throughout the last year. This research project was launched to really understand women leaders' motivations, obstacles, and success strategies in their careers, because we wanted to make sure that the center was providing what women needed in terms of leadership topics. And we wanted to make sure that we really understood the audience. So we created a 20-question quantitative survey with optional commentary boxes. And it was sent out principally to our community. So our University of Arizona Global Campus students, staff, and faculty, around 40,000 people, plus our Center for Women's Leadership members. So there are some people outside of our community represented here as well. And in the future, we anticipate that this, our research will be more inclusive outside of our community as well. The survey deployment took place over 2 months, June to August of 2020, and we had 1,300 total respondents. Once we did the data cleaning, that led to about a little over 1,000 clean responses. And the survey data was what surprised us the most, that we had in those optionary commentary boxes, everybody wanted to chat, and this was wonderful. It provided a great picture of what is going on in women's lives and careers. So we had 80 plus pages of commentary and 123 volunteers for future interviews. So thank you for that. Let's take a look at the data. Now, I've put all of this up on the screen in one snapshot because I think it's helpful to understand who responded to the survey. We see that out of these 1,000 plus women, the vast majority of them were between 30 and 49 years of age. So well established in their lives and in their careers. We also see that they are fully employed in most cases and beyond fully employed. So you'll see employed full-time with one job was about 58%. And then employed full-time with more than one job was about 11%. That is a statistic that we are very interested in studying further as well. How much of the additional employment is due to achieving one's goals with their career versus a need to fill in a pay gap? And there's probably both going on in some cases, but we'd like to dig into that from a research perspective. In terms of race and ethnicity, we found that the respondents they represent many diversity categories, but it is a largely white population. So 55% of respondents were white. The second largest group were African Americans at 23%. Now, just as a frame of reference, this is fairly close to representing our university community. It is more diverse than the US community society at large when we look at statistics. So we'd love to see even more diversity brought into our future research. In terms of career level, we see that these are quite experienced women. So the range here, you'll see experienced, which we categorized as 5 to 9 years, is about 22% of our respondents. And we had mid-career at 10 to 14 years and advanced career at 15 years or more. And you'll see that 34% of respondents were in advanced career. These are women who have put a lot of time into building their careers. A few other pieces on demographics. In terms of marital status, we found that there was a split here. The majority were married with 47.67%, but also 27% were single, never married, and there were a few others in each category. In terms of number of children, again, there's also a split here. 29% did not have children. And then the next largest group had 2 children. In terms of being sole provider for the family, we found this quite interesting. About half of the population that we surveyed were sole providers for their family. So we see that about 45.57% were taking care of the family on their own. In terms of adult caretaking responsibilities, we were a little surprised to see this wasn't higher. So 72% said they do not serve as the primary caretaker for an adult. And the reason that we surveyed with this particular question is we know that women, especially in middle age, mid-career, tend to be double saddled with both childcare and elder care. And so we wanted to see if this impacted the population we had surveyed. And this was not a major consideration for the majority. In terms of student status, this is an ambitious and hardworking group of women. We see that 55.6% of them were full-time undergraduate students. And if we combine this with those who are full-time graduate students, that is the majority of the population. 48% were also working full-time and going to school full-time. And 36% of those are undergraduate students. So if we pause here for a minute and reflect on the population, we're seeing women who are quite experienced in their career, they're very invested in terms of the number of years, and they're in school to build their credentials. So they're leading quite busy lives. We also wanted to find out how satisfied this population was with both their career and their lives. We wanted to see what kind of influence their satisfaction in either might have on their experience. We found that they're largely somewhat satisfied with their career. You'll see about 39, almost 40% there that are somewhat satisfied. And if you combine that with the extremely satisfied, it's a little over 60, 70% were mostly satisfied with their career. We see similar numbers in terms of their satisfaction with life. 52% that were somewhat satisfied and 23% that were extremely satisfied. What about their motivations? So let's get into the actual questions on the survey itself. We wanted to know women's career goals in the next 5 years because we wanted to see how important career growth might be for them. And we found it was very important. So you'll see I've highlighted in red the categories with the greatest percentage. The majority of women who we studied wanted to be promoted in their current company. Some of them wanted to seek positions in a new company, and some of them were looking to change career fields. About 20% wanted to change career fields, but overwhelmingly, 30% plus wanted a promotion of some kind. So they're looking to build, to cross that rung on the ladder, if you will. What are some of the obstacles that they face? So we listed a number of different challenges and barriers that were all drawn from research. What does research tell us about the common challenges and barriers? And that's what we surveyed on here. And we found that overwhelmingly high levels of stress were impacting women, lack of advancement and low compensation, and inconsiderate or unsupportive managers. That was a smaller percentage, but a little under 10% said that their managers were really the obstacle to their careers. What are some of the strategies they've used to persist? And this was interesting because, as we analyzed the data, we were reflecting on the experience of ourselves and other women that we've worked with through the years, and there was a lot of resonance here. This strategy to just work harder was prevalent in the surveys. So we see that about 22% of women said that that was their principal strategy. Professional development was up there. And then sadly, sacrificing personal or family time for work was up there as well. We did have a few people take the survey. About 40 people took the survey who were not female. And there were some pretty pointed commentary about how sacrificing personal or family time for work was just not an option. But those commentaries only landed in the non-female respondents when we analyzed the qualitative data. So it seems that this is not necessarily a choice, but something that women have felt based on their commentaries they had to do to maintain and to grow their career further. What are some of the results of those strategies then? Does working harder pay off for these women? And they found that it generally does not. And so we've begun calling this the rewarded with more work result. And so these women have said, really what's happened is they've gotten more responsibilities in their current job, the harder they work. That's not necessarily translated to promotion and better pay. And so some people have expressed in the commentary that these responsibilities were fulfilling in some regard, but they were very hopeful that it would also translate to more tangible rewards in the future. One bright side that we'll point out here is that the greatest percentage of respondents in this category said that their efforts have led to improved self-confidence. So the additional time spent in one's career and professional development did have a payoff in terms of confidence. So that is perhaps a win. Improved self-esteem also came up as a growth area. So what do women say they need to succeed? So you'll see that we asked here, what would help you achieve your career goals and improve your career satisfaction in terms of support, resources, and professional development? Again, all of the categories here were drawn from research, and the respondents told us that the number one area that they really need to succeed is our resources and education specific to their field, role, or industry. So given that this population is already embedded in their work and careers, it naturally would follow they're trying to become more expert in these areas. And some of the commentaries said that as well. Women were working towards very specific advancement opportunities into a greater level of expertise or an executive level role. They also said that they needed some additional professional development opportunities, mentoring and coaching help, and a graduate degree or other advanced credential. Now, the graduate degree we know is, it naturally would follow, given the population that we've surveyed. These are people who are very invested in their education. But when we look outside of this population in research, we know that degree seeking is also important to a broader population. So how are their organizations currently supporting them? And you'll see that we've highlighted here that organizations are doing a good job, according to these women surveyed, of posting new jobs on the company website. So there's transparency about the jobs that are available. They also felt that everyone had an equal chance to apply for those jobs. Now, applying and being considered for them might be separate issues here, but the way that we worded this is if there was equal chance to apply, and they said that that is largely the case. They also felt that their companies were doing a good job upholding legal standards in terms of equal employment opportunity. They said laws are being applied adequately in my organization. So you'll see that 14, 13, 18% of respondents highlighted these three areas. But look at what is not highlighted. That was of interest to us. Leadership and HR educating employees about ways to grow their careers. A very small percentage of women said that that was the case. My supervisor and manager discussing my career goals and potential growth on a regular basis. Also small. I have my manager's support and a clear plan of working towards my next promotion. One of the smaller areas that women said was happening in their organization. So we're going to press pause for a minute in this section to really reflect on what this research has informed for us in terms of action that could be done to move forward to address inequality and improve career success. So in terms of our population that we surveyed, what were some of the areas that really need attention? We've also pulled in some research beyond this study about activities that could really help as well. So as promised in the agenda, I said we would take a moment to reflect on the significance and the impact of the continued inequality. And I think that this is particularly important because as with any survey, anyone on this session who's ever done research before, you get people who are quite candid about their feelings about the topic itself that they're being surveyed on. And we did have commentary from some that said, discrimination against women doesn't exist any longer. There's no such thing as inequality for women. If women just worked harder, they would get the jobs that they were seeking or the advancements that they were seeking. And we can see across the research that I shared at the beginning and the 1,000 women that we've studied, that the majority of them don't feel that way. The majority of research is really pointing to this continued inequality. We see that underrepresentation is going to be an ongoing issue that could perpetuate bias in organizations and society. This very notion of being able to see women in leadership positions is quite impactful. And we know this of studies of young girls, for example, whether they believe they're able to be a leader in the future, or to be a president of a country in the future, or to have their own business. These are all impacted by representation. And for those of you that are really interested in this representation and perception research, I invite you to look at the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. They've produced some really compelling research, particularly with young girls, about how this impacts their vision for their future. The second area that we would highlight is this gap in the leadership pipeline, that 30% of women that are not making it into the management positions are not as likely to move into the management positions means slow change. And so how could we increase the rate of change? There's a negative climate that persists around bias, especially among Black women and women with disabilities. Those two populations, unfortunately, pop up in the research as being incredibly marginalized when we compare their experience to that of other women in their career. There's untapped talent. So we're limiting innovation and organizational results. As the statistics showed, there tends to be an association with financial performance and success and innovation when there's more diversity in higher level roles. Employee engagement is at risk. Now, this is one for my fellow leadership educators out there, or leadership development professionals, those of you out in corporations doing this work on a daily basis. You feel this one, I know. Fairness and opportunity are at risk because the perception of these. When we look at employee engagement research, we know that even if someone themselves feels that they're being treated fairly, if they see that other people in the organization are not treated fairly, it impacts their engagement. So overall, employee engagement is at risk when fairness and opportunity are compromised for others. And families suffer. As I mentioned, financial insecurity, especially for female heads of house, is a very real and persistent issue. So let's take a look at organizational actions to address inequities. There are three areas that I would highlight here, and these are really building blocks. From the bottom to the top is how I'll address these. The first is to eliminate structural inequities. The second is to implement support systems, and the third is to increase representation. In terms of structural inequities, this refers to the number of females who are currently represented in the organization. Look at actual representation across levels, departments, and roles. We have read research after research of organizations who have said, we don't have inequity here. But until they actually looked at the numbers, this bias that there was not inequity persisted. Once they looked at the numbers, they found that there were real inequities in their organization. And so the call to action here is to do an actual evaluation. Look across levels, departments, and roles. Sometimes, there could be a particular department, for example, where there's a real opportunity. In terms of salary, conduct a salary review. In this research, there was a woman sharing her experience, for example, one of many, who had said, I was managing a group of people and my employees made more than me. So take a look at the salary across the organization to see who's impacted and where there might be some unconscious bias or some very real bias in play around salary. Make adjustments to ensure equal pay and benefits across similar positions. So then we get into implementing support systems. There are three areas that really pop out in the research, and one is around creating an organizational culture that is aware and supportive. The awareness is around calling these issues out very clearly. By having departments do an equity review, it calls it out. Now, some organizations have taken an educational approach, and education can certainly have positive impact. But we know that education alone is not enough to remove structural inequities or to create a support system. So that would be part of the strategy that we would highlight here. In terms of creating a supportive culture, management development can be very helpful in that regard. So specifically develop inclusive entry-level management development programs. That can be very helpful to fix that broken rung on the ladder and provide mentorship. Now, there's some great critical commentary out there about mentorship. What's the best way to approach this? And so I invite you all to consider what this might look like in your own organizations. We know that mentorship can be very positive, but clearly the way that mentorship happens has to be authentic. It has to be specifically helpful to the person who's trying to develop their career. So you can promote that mentorship and sponsorship relationship in your organizations in a way that aids on the job development. It's not just about developing a great relationship or a network, it's about really helping further that person in their career. And then lastly, increase representation. Now, this is intentionally last because if we started there and we didn't have a system that was supportive, if we had gross structural inequities, of course, the very people that we brought in would not want to stay. So increasing representation is this final step in terms of recruitment that's intentional, developing women at all levels of organizations, and then also engaging employees across diversity groups. So keep a pulse on employee engagement, especially when it comes to with respect to fairness and opportunity for all, because that's so pivotal in employee engagement. I'm going to share one more piece here on individual actions to build career before we move to the Q&A. So I know that many of you probably joined this session specifically because you're looking for individual actions to build your career. There are 4 pieces that popped out of this particular research and are supported in other research. I want to pause for a moment on this picture in the middle, and it is a woman, with all of these downward arrows, these forces working against her, if you will, and she's pulling them up. The message here is not that women are entirely responsible for fixing all of this themselves. Structural inequities are real. We see this in the research. We also see that women are saying that they're working so hard already. They're already overwhelmed with high stress. So the message here is not to go out and necessarily work even harder. The message is to find where you can make a measurable change or a positive change that supports your career and development. So the first is to set a vision and an intention. We know from research, and this came out very strongly in our respondents, that they weren't always making their intentions known. Some of them said that they were afraid to share what their ambition was, that they didn't have families that were supportive of what they wanted to do, for example, that they had self-doubt. But we know that when we look at those who have been successful in their career, it's largely about creating a branding and a platform and connections that support that development. So the suggestion from research is to really create that vision for your career and then make those intentions known. When people know our intentions, they're more likely to think of us for those opportunities, more likely to help. Building network becomes very important as well. And this was a really important area in terms of our respondents. I would highlight for those 1,000 women who responded that this is perhaps one of the greatest areas of opportunity. So few of them said that their strategies included being involved in a professional association or developing in their career field specifically. So join and be active in professional associations to connect with those resources and people. That's a great place to find mentorship and sponsorship. Create or join a peer support group. I say create because many of the women in the survey said they simply don't have that support in their lives. They don't have it in their career, they don't have it in their families, they don't have it with their partner. And if that is the case, know that there's a lot of organizations that are looking to provide forums for this. Leanin.org has these wonderful lean in support groups that can be very helpful. Most professional associations have them as well, and you could certainly create your own. Here at the Center for Women's Leadership, we have a mentoring program that we would invite you to as well, and that's where we create some great support for people's career growth. And then lastly, be visible in your career field. Advertise your accomplishments, advertise your big and small wins. So joining LinkedIn can be a great way to do that. What are some actions that could be taken? Pursue meaningful development. So professional development was called out as an area that women said would really support them further in building their career. So make that a priority. Stay current in your field. This is especially important for women who have had to step out of their field for childcare, to take care of an elder, and certainly with the rapid pace of change in our world, staying current is important. Be an equity and inclusion champion for yourself and others. So by helping others, we can help ourselves as well. Improving the climate in our organizations. Ask for a salary review and promotion. We see that the statistics aren't great about women asking for those things. We saw a statistic that said that they do it at the same rate as men, but it was below 30%. So there's an opportunity to ask for that as well. And the last piece that we would highlight, my fellow researchers and I, are really to advocate for your own self-care. This issue of higher stress and workloads was really, compelling across our organization, or across the study. Women said that this was an issue for them. Seek to work for companies who are equity champions. So if you currently work in an organization that is not inclusive, is not focused on equity, maybe it's time to seek a new role or a new company. If you don't have support, create a support network. And make time for what fulfills you. We know from research, from strengths-based leadership research specifically, that when we focus on our strengths and what we care about, our natural talents shine. And when they do, people notice us for that. And that can be very helpful for one's career. For those of you that would like to get some additional professional development and insights, I'll highlight that the week of March 5th through 12th, the Center for Women's Leadership is doing a series of events to honor women's resilience, and you'll see a number of events here on the screen. I won't go through them all in the interest of time. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but you can register on our Center for Women's Leadership homepage. You can Google that as well. And with that, I'm going to open up to questions. Let's see what we have in the chat.
Hey, Jenny, we have had some really good conversations going on in the chat. I've been monitoring it. A few of the interesting things that I pulled out. One participant questioned Roz Brewer with Walgreens, whether her salary would be comparable with her white male counterparts. I think that's certainly something to think about.
Mm-hmm. So the question there was whether the salary would be comparable.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So research shows us that there tend to be inequities, but what an organization is doing to address those or not, we couldn't speak to here. So my best suggestion is to ask for an equity review. Many companies have decided to be quite forward thinking in the way that they address compensation by removing this age-old restriction about people discussing their salaries, with the very idea that by being transparent, we are then more aware of where are inequities. But some organizations still have this rule in place that people are not to discuss their compensation. So my best suggestion is to work with your organization to see what you can do personally.
Great. We also had another comment that I thought was especially interesting, especially I know many of us here are parents. One participant questioned whether some of the statistics related to women being hesitant to apply for a job if they didn't have the qualifications versus men applying for jobs when they may not even have the qualifications. And the audience member suggested maybe it has something to do with how we're raising our boys and girls. Maybe we are raising our sons to be risk takers, and maybe we're, raising our daughters to be a bit more conservative or, a bit more towards perfectionism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would invite you to, again, look at the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. They've done these terrific co-branded studies with organizations that look at young women, especially in some pretty uh, in developing countries, and how their image of what they can be in the world, how that's impacted by social norms and upbringing. They do some work in the US as well, but the short answer is yes, there's definitely an influence. I do think that things are changing in some families where there's more equity, but again, that's so specific to family and culture and location of the world.
Great. I think that is just about it for the major questions that were posed.
Great. Well, we have a lot of people here on the session, and I would just invite you that if you have questions that you did not want to ask in person today on this session, but you'd like to connect with us, feel free to reach out. You can send an email to our Center for Women's Leadership at cwl@uagc.edu, and that'll find its way to myself and my co-researchers here. We're happy to connect with you and answer your questions. I really appreciate Brandy, your tech support, and the whole Center for Women's Leadership team that's behind the scenes here. Thank you to the 150 plus people who attended today. We're really looking forward to seeing you at our next events in March. Have a great day.